From To Keto LLC, it's Keto Woman Podcast with Daisy Brackenhall.
Hello, Keto lovelies. I'm Daisy Brackenhall, and I've spent most of my life struggling with my weight and confidence, and have always had a difficult relationship with food. Even when I finally got to my target weight, after weight loss surgery and eating low carb, I couldn't maintain it and I was miserable. Keto has given me the freedom to fall in love with food again, without the constant gain, loss, guilt, virtue cycle of before. Health and happiness is where it's at now, running on fat. Welcome to the Keto Woman Podcast. Each week I'll be chatting to inspirational women, maybe even the odd man, to discover the secrets to their success so that I can share them with you. So what is keto? Keto is a way of eating that enables you to switch your body's main fuel source from sugar to fat. Who doesn't want to be a fat burner, right? But how do we achieve this? A great place to start is by keeping carbs to 20 grams or less per day. So things like leafy greens and above ground vegetables, plus some nuts and seeds, and the incidental carbs you find in things like dairy. Moderate protein, scale to your lean body mass, and then fat to satiety. Once you're in the swing of things, you can tweak it to suit you. Make your own personalised keto. I'll be asking my guest each week what their keto looks like to show you just how flexible and fabulous this way of eating can be. I'm not a doctor, and most of my guests won't be either, so we can't give you medical advice. It's always best to work with your own doctor because they know you and your medical history, and so have access to the bigger picture. This week's extraordinary woman is Carrie Diulus. Dr. Carrie Diulus is one of just a handful of board-certified female orthopaedic spine surgeons in the United States. She practices patient-centered medicine rather than the traditional disease-centered model. She starts by identifying all of the factors that influence a patient's health. This understanding is then combined with state-of-the-art, minimally invasive surgical and medical care, including complementary and nutritional approaches, to develop an individualized program for each patient's unique needs. This is the philosophy Dr. Diulus brought to the Crystal Clinic Spine Wellness Center in Akron, Ohio. Prior to joining the Crystal Clinic in 2014, Dr. Diulus was a spine surgeon in the Center for Spine Health at the Cleveland Clinic, and she maintains privileges at Cleveland Clinic regional hospitals. Dr. Keri received her medical degree from Northeast Ohio Medical University. Prior to her orthopaedic surgery training at the Cleveland Clinic, she trained as a pathologist. She completed her spine fellowship with the Spine Care Medical Group in San Francisco. Additionally, Dr. Diulus is a thriving type 1 diabetic who utilizes a low-carbohydrate diet with specialized insulin strategies both for herself and her diabetic patients to have powerful impact on the management of these conditions. Dr. Diulus has co-authored textbook chapters, presented at national and international professional meetings, teaches and leads instructional courses for the North American Spine Society, and is on the ethics board for the North American Spine Society. She has published in the areas of orthopedics, lifestyle modification, nutrition, diabetes healthcare, IT, pathology, and biomaterials. Her research focuses on reducing the burden of chronic disease and total cost of care, along with reducing and improving comorbidities while improving outcomes in orthopedic and spine patients. I love it when someone changes my opinion on something and teaches me something new. I was very inspired by Keri, and her passion for a plant-based way of eating was infectious. I had previously thought that being a vegan keto was possible but would be really tough and just too restrictive for most people. But Keri has opened my eyes to just how fabulous and varied a vegan keto diet can be. Don't believe me? Well, just you wait and see. Welcome, Keri, to the Keto Woman Podcast. How are you doing today?
I am fantastic. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. We've actually got some sunshine in France for a change.
And us as well in northeastern Ohio, which is another unusual place to have it.
Right. Well, we both lucked out today then. Good for the weekend.
Absolutely.
So tell me a bit about what you do and what brought you into low carb keto in the first place.
I am an orthopedic spine surgeon. In the United States, well, across the world, that's actually, as a woman, is somewhat unusual. I was, to the best that we can figure, the 7th woman who was trained here in the United States as an orthopedic spine surgeon. And diet has been a huge part of my life for as long as I can remember back. And to sort of jump to the end and then go back to the story, I use a lot of dietary strategies with my patients because it significantly impacts spine health. And there's more and more studies that are coming out around that, including things like vitamin D and omega-3s and omega-6s, and how beta-hydroxybutyrate is a potent anti-inflammatory. And we decrease pain and improve surgical outcomes with the ketogenic low-carb diet. So I utilize that in all of my surgical patients. But throughout the process, spine conditions are related to obesity and diabetes. So the vast majority of my patients, over 75%, have some degree of metabolic syndrome. And so it's a significant thing. From a professional standpoint, here in the United States, payment reimbursement for surgeries is moving towards what we call bundled payments. And because of that, if a patient has complications related to surgery, those come out of that bundled payment, and any surgical complications are paid for through that money, and there's no increase reimbursement if a patient has a complication. So all of a sudden, there is a big interest within the surgical community in how do we optimize patients before surgery so that we improve their outcomes and thus improve reimbursement. So I would love to say that it was all altruistic and we're finally getting to the point where we just want to do the right thing, but economics are always the biggest drivers of change.
It's good that it's on your side though, isn't it? Works well.
Right. Because before, I was, again, my whole life is sort of about being the odd duck out in that, female orthopedic spine surgeon who does dietary counseling. I sort of did it quietly before, and now all of a sudden, the North American Spine Society, we're recording webinars and having conferences, and my speaking dance card is filling up already for next year, which is a good problem to have.
Exactly. Well, that's great. I mean, we so often complain that the money's not in line with our way of thinking. So to have it in accord, very fortuitous.
Yep. So how I got into all of the nutritional stuff, obesity is a prominent factor in my family. And I started to gain weight when I was 12, as many women do. And at that point, it's sort of a silly story, but I read one of those teeny bop girl magazines, and there was a prominent celebrity who was following the Pritikin diet, which for those who don't know is very low fat, low sugar, low sodium. And I started that diet. It's plant-based. And at that point, I'm plant-based now, and I'll sort of discuss how I got to that point, although I'm very low carb and in ketosis all the time. But I have never been a huge fan of meat. And maybe it was an active teenage rebellion, I'm not sure. But at 12, I gave up meat and all animal protein and spent that way for the better part of 20 years. And I've come back to it. So I lost all of the weight, or I prevented some of the teenage weight gain until I got into college. And for varying reasons, some circumstances that happened, I ended up gaining about 100 pounds in college and have since lost that 100 pounds. And initially, the way I lost it was through the traditional dogmatic way of calories in, calories out. I went back to running and cycling, which had been passions of mine, and ended up actually on the U.S. national duathlon team and competed in nationals, which duathlon is run, bike, run, and did marathons and was a competitive cyclist. And a lot of that honestly had to do with the fact that in order for me to keep the weight off, I seem to have to increasingly exercise more.
That's the thing. It becomes progressive, doesn't it? If it does work to reduce calories and move more, but you've got to keep doing it.
You've got to keep doing it. And I was low fat and plant-based, and I also have celiac, so I was gluten-free. I went back at a time when no one knew what gluten was. I mean, this was 25 years ago. I'm in my mid-40s now, and I was diagnosed in my 20s. And I was one of the rare ones that gained weight with celiac, although we're now realizing that's not so rare. And I had to keep restricting more and more of what I was eating, which I think in and of itself results in some disordered eating, which I thought was potentially an issue, but now it's not an issue. So it's not a thing for me in my life. And my relationship with food is fantastic at this point. And I always sort of joke that my genetics are not compatible with life after 35. So the fact that, I'm in my mid-40s and my hormone levels are great and my energy levels are better than they've ever been, and I don't worry about weight at all, speaks a lot to how well the ketogenic type approach works for me. So I lost all of the weight, was competing. I was a pathology resident at the time, and then I injured my knee and sort of realized if I couldn't work out 20 hours a week, I didn't want to sit and look at a microscope for the rest of my life. And I switched back to my primary love in medical school, which was orthopedic surgery. And I thought I was going to be an orthopedic sports medicine doctor, but realized that they spend most of their time watching other people do sports, and I wanted to actually be doing them. And I didn't really like watching others do sports. I just wanted to be active. Fell in love with spine surgery and spine patients and the way I could impact them. And so ultimately I did my orthopedic residency at the Cleveland Clinic and spine fellowship in San Francisco. During my residency, I got pregnant with my daughter, gained 60 pounds during that. Subsequently later, gained 60 pounds with my pregnancy with my son, or I should say 57 pounds because I watched really, really closely what I ate. Prior to getting pregnant with my kids actually was my first experience with low carb. At that point, and so this was 14 years ago, at that point, I was eating animal protein. And South Beach diet, which you may remember was a thing, although that was predominantly low carb, high protein, low fat. So I sort of did my own version of that, which when I look back, of course, I am notorious for tracking everything that I do. So when I look back at those logs, I was really low carb, moderate protein, high fat.
Right.
And it optimized my weight for my wedding, and I was super excited about it. And then I got pregnant with my daughter, and I went back and wanted to be the perfect host for the growing fetus. And I followed all of the grain guidelines, and it was gluten-free grains, but nonetheless, I gained a ton of weight.
I've never really understood that. It seems to come up so often with women who have been low carb keto, then discover they're pregnant and suddenly think they need to change their diet back to a high carb. I don't know why that would be. If they found that their health is optimized before pregnancy, surely it would be sensible to carry on doing the same thing. Is it purely that it's just the advice that is given by the system?
It's the advice, it's the guidelines. As a pregnant mom, everything that's online, I actually went on and I followed a program that told me how many servings of complex carbohydrates to eat a day, which was the vast majority of the diet. And there was belief that the growing fetus's brain needed carbohydrates in the mom. And the reality of it is the fetus will take what it needs. And the way we treat gestational diabetes is with a low carbohydrate diet, in addition to sometimes medications. But the first recommendations are a low carbohydrate diet. So a lot of that science is changing, but there's still conflicting science, and there are still people out there within the scientific and medical community saying that a low carbohydrate diet is potentially dangerous during a pregnancy state.
And of course, every mother is going to want to do the very best for their growing child, aren't they? So if they're told that what they're doing is going to impact that baby negatively, I can see why that pressure would make them want to change completely.
Yep, of course. So fast forward, I went on staff at the Cleveland Clinic. I was trying to lose weight after my son was born because of the same thing that happened. And I did, at that point, why I didn't go back to low carb is not clear to me at the time, other than I was breastfeeding. And so I went back to what I thought was appropriate, which was calorie counting, and it just didn't work. Ironically, I saw a movie, Fat, Sick, and Nearly Dead, which is with a guy named Joe Cross, and it was about juice fasting. So just to, I have literally tried everything. In fact, while I was in my fellowship at one point, I was raw vegan for about a year. And again, looking back, I was low carb, and that's probably why it was so successful for me. I actually did a 42-day juice fast, which again, people think that that's higher carbohydrate, but the way I was doing it, ironically, was low carb in the sense that there was no fruit other than maybe a tiny bit of apple and lemon or lime in the juices that I was using. Lost all of the weight, felt great. Again, went back to what was the primary recommendations amongst the plant-based community, which was sort of low fat, high carb, moderate protein. Started gaining weight again. I was out lecturing at the time on how do we impact obesity and diabetes in type 2 diabetic patients, and was speaking mostly plant-based, but was talking about low carbohydrate, but I wasn't doing it so much in my own life. And I went for an executive physical while I was on staff at the Cleveland Clinic, and she called me back in the room and she said, your hemoglobin A1C is elevated and this is concerning. And I was like, how is that possible? So that was a huge shock to me, because here I was out speaking about it. And then I get my own labs. And so I was misdiagnosed as type 2 diabetes in the beginning. I implemented all of the changes I recommended for my patients. So I had some things I could clean up in my diet. And I went what I call low carbohydrate, sort of pescatarian paleo at that point. And as happens so I was in the honeymoon phase of type 1 diabetes, and I got to the point where I just couldn't control my blood sugars with that. And then I ended up going very ketogenic to the point where at one point I was zero carb. I was sort of in the carnivore state. And I just couldn't control my blood sugars because my pancreas was failing and I needed insulin. And I got sick and the wheels sort of came off, and I ended up going onto insulin. And of course I did what you were supposed to do. I followed the guidelines and went on the sort of ADA diet so that I could dose insulin, and which was more grains, more carbohydrates. And my blood sugars ranged on a day from 40 to 400. And it was miserable. And I gained 10 pounds immediately starting insulin. So when I hear the arguments about calories in, calories out versus the insulin model, the hormone model around obesity, it's sort of absurd to me that we're still having this conversation, because if you want to gain weight, just inject insulin.
Exactly. That's pretty black and white, isn't it?
Yeah, have high insulin levels. Now, to be fair, I still think calories matter. I mean, I can say, when I get, it's sort of fingernails on the chalkboard to me when I hear people talking about eating an unlimited amount of fat on a ketogenic diet. And I can tell you that is the fastest way for me to gain weight that I'm not interested in. So, I've been utilizing for a number of years now actively with my patients the full ketogenic diet. And that's how I maintain my blood sugars. I have an A1C that ranges from 4.6 to 5.2. My blood sugar spikes when I do complex spine surgeries, but not from food. I do give insulin for protein. And how I got plant-based, I probably should. So I was eating a variation of ketogenic diet, sometimes low carb, high protein. I sort of track everything that I do and pay attention in what it does to my blood sugars and my other labs. And my blood sugars were great with both a more keto approach or a low carb, high protein approach, but I didn't feel great. And my energy levels weren't great. And my high sensitivity CRP, which is a marker of inflammation, I could never get it below 1. I couldn't get it below 1.3, to be exact. And then I got sick. And I ended up in DKA, which is diabetic ketoacidosis, which is, of course, here I am, a type 1 diabetic who's always in nutritional ketosis. And it took getting really, really sick to cause ketoacidosis. But after that, I got a post-viral gastroparesis, which is a thing that can happen to anyone. It probably had nothing to do with the fact that I'm a type 1 diabetic, just bad luck, because of course I didn't need anything else in my life going on. And during that time, my stomach stopped working. So all of a sudden, I had to figure out how to get nutrients in. I was losing weight rapidly. It was hard to manage my type 1 diabetes. And I had to figure out how to get nutrients in, or I was going to end up with a feeding tube if it progressed until we didn't know how long it was going to take to reverse. So I initially started I bought from a specialty lab in California just amino acids that were broken down because I couldn't tolerate any forms of protein, or they sort of just shut my stomach down. So I was able to use smoothies with MCT oil. MCT doesn't actually impact, it can speed up gastric emptying. So I learned all of the science around gastric emptying and all of how proteins are handled and how the different fats are handled. So looking back, it was brilliant that it happened because I got to learn a lot more science that I wouldn't have otherwise learned. Mm-hmm. And I found that plant-based proteins were easier for me to get in. And I got to the point where I could do some fish, although truly I'm not a huge fan of fish. I mean, it just comes back to being plant-based is not a religion for me. It's just the way I feel best and prefer to eat. So I sort of said, why am I fighting this? I'm going to embrace this plant-based low carbohydrate diet, which everyone says can't happen. You can't, even recently I heard some of the big names in keto, the keto community saying by definition, a plant-based diet is high carbohydrate, and I am living proof that it's not. Mm-hmm. So I eat very low carbohydrate, although I count net carbs from whole foods, and I think that's an important thing. I am not a huge fan of net carbs when it comes to the processed bars and shakes and treats. So an avocado, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, asparagus, I think net carbs are applicable. And plant-based sources of protein, black soybeans, lupini beans, sacha inchi seeds, hemp, chia seeds, all of those things, pea protein if I'm going to do a smoothie. And I just sort of embraced it. And honestly, it's been the best thing that I've ever done. And I've been this way for quite a while now. And my high sensitivity CRP is now as low as can be measured on a lab test. My blood sugars are perfect. My energy levels are great. So I would I be fine going back to, animal-based protein? I always say that, if my body gives me indication that I need animal protein, I'll go back tomorrow. But right now I have zero reason to do it. And I do supplement with things like algal oil so that I can get the omega-3s. I would be fine using fish oil, but it's sort of become a challenge to continue to hold this space and be entirely vegan. And so I just keep doing it. And so it's been a fun challenge, and I feel amazing, and my sleep is great, and my energy levels are great. So here I am, plant-based keto.
And what about B12? That's a supplement that's often thrown out that vegans simply have to have.
Yeah, so it's always an issue. You cannot get enough B12. Although I use nutritional yeast because I like the way that it tastes, and the brand that I use has it supplemented. A lot of my patients who are omnivores need to supplement with B12 anyway because of an MTHFR deficiency. So I have an MTHFR variant, so I have to supplement with a methylcobalamin and methylfolate anyway. It's always comes up with the ideal human diet and supplements, and do you need to supplement? And the number one diet that's deficient in nutrients is the standard American diet. So, if we're comparing any of these diets, most of my patients, even on a ketogenic diet, we find that they're deficient in omega-3s. So because omega-3s are such an important anti-inflammatory hormone, we work toward, not hormone, but they impact the enzymes. So omega-3s and omega-6 compete for the same enzyme. Omega-3 is an anti-inflammatory, omega-6 is a pro-inflammatory. So I significantly limit the omega-6 in my patient's diet, in my diet as well. So no seed oils, canola, corn oil, soybean oil, any of those processed oils. And we focus on increasing omega-3s. And most of the time, particularly if I have somebody that has a lot of inflammation, then we supplement with omega-3 fish oil or algal oil if they're plant-based. Most of my patients are vitamin D deficient, and K2 is really important. K2 comes from eggs and hard cheeses and Japanese natto, which is where I get it, which is a fermented soybean, which is an acquired taste, but I love it. And so, I do supplement my patients in order to optimize their diet and optimize their health. So, yes, the vegan diet is deficient in B12, and absolutely that can be a criticism. But, again, I supplement my omnivore patients as well. So that becomes a tricky reason for me to go back to eating meat when it, resulted for me at least in increased inflammation.
Exactly. That doesn't seem a good enough reason. It's just something that is highlighted that, you need to be aware of and you need to supplement. I don't think there's necessarily any problem with supplementation. It's just being aware of what you're missing, if there's something missing from your diet. And you find, and I think the other thing is that the more restrictive you are in any direction, the more focused you have to be on what you're eating and making sure you're getting adequate variety. I mean, that's the thing that's often brought up with being vegan on keto, is that the variety is limited, that you're going to be stuck with this sort of small group of foods that to get the sort of macro balance you need, it's going to be really hard to do. But it sounds like you found a really good variety of things to eat.
So there are a ton of foods that I can eat. I mean, this is the fascinating thing to me, and I think it is important to optimize. I don't know if you know who Marty Kendall is, but he has the Nutrient Optimizer program. And I think last I checked, I was number 3 on the leaderboard for that.
Oh, right.
And it was helpful. Looking at that, there were things that I hadn't included in my diet, like endive. So from the standpoint of being plant-based, I can include every non-starchy vegetable that somebody who is animal-based includes. And there's a ton of them. I've never tolerated eggs and dairy ever. I have an allergy to them both. So those were not an option for me. So it actually was sort of felt more restrictive on the more omnivore type, or when I was sort of, zero carb. And then the protein sources that I use are, like I said, lupini beans, soy, sacha inchi seeds, baru nuts and seeds, chia seeds, hemp seeds, I'm sure there's some that I'm missing here, that pea protein. And again, I'm more whole foods than using supplements, but I will use a protein shake occasionally. After I do my heavy workout day, I do high intensity interval training and lifting, and I use a protein supplement after that.
Do you have to watch the omega-6 balance with things like the nuts and seeds? Because they're quite dominant, aren't they?
Yeah, I don't do a ton of nuts, but I think it is a factor. I think it's less of a factor when we're talking about whole foods that have the phytonutrients that come along with them. And as we look at some of the data on oils versus whole plant foods, you can measure inflammation in varying different ways after someone has these different things. And when things come in the form that nature created them, it's sort of as to, quote Robert Lustig, when nature puts something that's a potential poison in a food, it puts the anecdote along with it. So
as long as you keep it as the whole food.
As long as the whole food. So there's a study on carrot juice and the recurrence of breast cancer and lung cancer. And what they found was that patients who had carrot juice, not that that's something that we do in the low carb community, but they had a reduction of recurrence of breast cancer and lung cancer if they had regular consumption of carrot juice. So the belief was that it was from the beta carotene. So they did a study where they gave subjects beta carotene supplements who had breast cancer and lung cancer, and they showed an increase in recurrence. So there's a whole lot that we don't understand. I mean, there are over 10,000 phytonutrients that are out there, and we understand some of them, like sulforaphane in broccoli. Sulforaphane in broccoli is a potent NRF2 stimulator, which turns off cancer-related genes and, helps to turn on things like autophagy and mitophagy and improve cellular functioning. So, and we're learning more about if you want to increase the sulforaphane in something like broccoli, or I use broccoli sprouts. So it starts out as glucoraphanin that has to be turned on by this enzyme called myrasinase, and it's highest in broccoli sprouts, and it's even higher if you heat the broccoli sprouts. I think it's about 70 degrees Celsius, although freezing the broccoli sprouts increases it. So I sprout my own broccoli, I freeze it, and then I put it into my smoothies or onto my salads. I make sort of a pesto with broccoli sprouts and basil and pine nuts and olive oil. So it's low carb, high fat, plant-based, and can go onto my protein sources. So when I start to list out my protein sources, there's a ton of them. When we list out the animal-based protein sources, it's chicken. I mean, it's effectively the same number of options.
And what about the bioavailability and the uptake in your body? Because that's certainly an argument that I've heard with plant-based proteins as opposed to animal-based, is that you can't pull as much protein.
So that's something that comes up often. I can tell you I do a lot of lab testing, and I tested my own amino acid levels. When I was super sick and didn't have enough calories or enough intake, my amino acid levels in my blood plummeted through the floor, and I had to fix them. And I fixed them with plant-based proteins. And then I've subsequently been measuring, and I have no amino acid deficiencies, and my protein levels are great. So where's the science around that? Just this past a week from today, there was a presentation done at one of the big nutritional meetings here in the United States that showed that the gut microbiome in people who are plant-based changes. And the thought is, there's more studies that are going to be done, but the thought is that the bacteria in the gut shift so that you can access more of the plant-based proteins. Because when we look at the populations, we don't see amino acid deficiencies in vegans that get adequate calories. And so the question became the why. And I always, it's one thing to say this is what we see, but I always go back to the biochemistry and the question of why. And I think, the human species is incredibly adaptable. We've got people who live equatorial that have, high carbohydrate, low fat type diets with sort of limited animal-based protein sources at times. And then you've got the Inuit and the Maasai. And so the question becomes, what is the one right diet for the human species? And the answer is there isn't. We're an incredibly adaptable species, which is why we exist.
That makes perfect sense. And I love the logic of that your body adapts to the diet that you want to eat. I mean, it's exactly the same argument that is used from switching from being a sugar burner to a fat burner, isn't it? That your body adapts to thrive in that environment. So it makes perfect sense to me that you can do it from animal-based to plant-based protein.
Yes, and our bodies are incredibly adaptable, and we can use these different approaches to impact the metabolic pathways. So Sarah Hallberg at there was a big Swiss nutritional meeting in Zurich, talked about, if we're talking about type 2 diabetes and obesity, there are 3 things that the science has shown are effective for treating: bariatric surgery, calorie restriction, which by definition ends up being low fat, or the ketogenic diet, the low carb diet. And so the biochemistry for me, so that was my undergraduate degree, and my focus as a pathologist was on biochemistry. And we can shift the cell receptors that are on the membrane at either end of the spectrum. So if you're very, very low fat, which then becomes higher carbohydrate typically, although it can be higher protein and low fat, the cell receptors change and you do become incredibly insulin sensitive. Typically, for that to be truly effective, it tends to be calorie restricted. And then the cytosolic and mitochondrial enzymes change based on what substrate is available. So if you either shift into being a sugar burner or being a fat burner. And that's why it takes about 3 days when you start to go into a ketogenic diet, or longer for some people. So if you do a fast, most people feel somewhat crappy for the first 3 days, and it's because the cell membrane biochemistry is changing from predominantly sugar burner to fat burner. And, now I can switch in and out of those easily because my body's gotten used to it. It's similar to the lactase enzyme in the gut. If you don't have dairy for a period of time, your body stops producing an enzyme that's not necessary. The body is not stupid. And so if it's not necessary, it's not going to waste amino acids making those enzymes.
Right.
And so it takes about 3 days for that machinery to start to upregulate, for that enzyme to come back. And the same sort of patterns we see happen when we're talking about the membrane receptors for carbohydrate versus fat. And the body goes, we hear a lot of this stuff about physiologic insulin resistance. I'm not a huge fan of that term because when we talk about insulin resistance, it's hard to unwrap that from the pathologic insulin resistance that happens with regard to obesity and diabetes. And so I like the term better, glucose sparing. There are, a small number of cells in the body, cell types, the red blood cells being one, and it's, as it turns out, most of the brain cells can run effectively on fats. There's still a little bit of controversy there. The brain can actually make its own ketones, some of the cells. And so, there's very limited need for glucose, but the body does have an absolute need for glucose, although there are essential amino acids and essential fatty acids, but there's no essential carbohydrate. Our body can manufacture all of the glucose it needs for survival from proteins and fats. So, that's how we're able to shift over from being a predominantly sugar burner to a fat burner. So interestingly now, when I work out or when I go, it used to be when I would go for a long run, my blood sugar would crash as a type 1 diabetic on insulin, because I would become more insulin sensitive during that time, and I would have to bring along a whole lot of carbohydrate, or I started using UCAN after talking to Jeff Volek. Now that I'm in nutritional ketosis and have been in nutritional ketosis for a long time, I actually get a blood sugar spike from exercise because my muscles notice that the glucose is there, but they're not interested in utilizing it. They're utilizing fats. And so I do, after a long run or an intense workout, have to give myself a little bit of insulin to sort of bring my blood sugar back down into a normal range.
It's fascinating to see how your body changes and adapts, isn't it? A minute ago, what Sarah Hallberg was saying about there are 3 ways to reverse or to fix type 2 diabetes. And interestingly enough, there's been a 2-part program on the BBC this week. And they took the calorie restriction approach and they put a group of patients into a clinic. So they lived and ate there for I think it was 4 weeks. So that was the 2-part. It was the 4 weeks in clinic, and then the second 4 weeks they were at home. And it was a shake diet. I think they were on 600 calories a day or something. And they didn't do enough tests that would have pleased me. I like
right.
seeing all the blood tests, but they did enough to show that basically it brought most of them in line, or certainly getting towards that point, depending how far into type 2 diabetes they were from their starting point. But they did look at the fat percentage in the liver, which was interesting. It was the blood sugar and the fat percentage in the liver were the two main markers that they used. And then the second month they carried on with the shakes, but at home, which was obviously going to be a lot more difficult. And they introduced exercise as well in the second month. And it all worked brilliantly. But the glaring problem that struck me was, how do you maintain that? You can fix the problem, and you can fix the problem relatively quickly. I mean, with bariatric surgery, you can almost fix it overnight, can't you? But what happens then?
A lot of patients eat themselves back out of bariatric surgery. So
that's the problem. What happens? The fixing the problem, it seems to me, is actually fairly quick and easy to do. But it's maintaining that, because presumably as soon as you stop doing whatever you're doing, it's all going to come rushing back.
Yeah, so that was my own personal experience. I mean, the reality for me was I struggled on the low fat, high carbohydrate, even plant-based diet and I would talk with all of the experts in the area, and they would say, well, clearly you're doing something wrong. And I would always push back against that and say, right, like I could win an Olympic medal in calorie counting. To this day, I still can't look at a plate of food and not, although I don't anymore, but if I switch that back on, I can immediately calculate the number of calories with relatively reasonable accuracy, because I used to weigh and measure everything. And you want to talk about disordered eating. I mean, put somebody on a calorie restricted diet and those behaviors come out. I used to sleep eat, where I wouldn't know what I was eating. We would wake up the next morning, my husband and I, and we're like, well, that's what happened last night, and stress eating and all of those things. And so what happened for me on the low-fat calorie restricted diet was my energy levels were low. My thyroid function started to not look great. My hair was falling out. My skin was dull. I was craving foods all the time. And since I've gone low carbohydrate and adequate amounts of healthy fats, all of that is gone. Not me going through some psychological treatment to get in touch with the emotional reasons that I would overeat. It's just gone. And so that's what I find with patients. Now, you can get into trouble in a low carbohydrate diet, for sure. You can eat in ways, lots of processed foods, the shakes, overeating butter. And I think if somebody's struggling to lose weight or they've regained the weight, there are situations where we need to look at adjusting that. Fasting can be helpful. Increasing nutrients can be helpful. Looking at where other, toxins and things like that can be getting into the system. There's, I use some stevia and erythritol, and I'm playing with monk fruit. And there's a company here in the United States that is called No Better Foods. And they use allulose as a sweetener, which is a natural sweetener that they extract.
Yes, I've heard people talking about that a lot lately. It seems to be one of the popular new ones.
Yeah, they have eggs in most of their products, although they've sent me some of their vegan products, and that they sort of make in small quantities that are not available commercially. And they taste great. My kids, their maple syrup is like off the charts delicious. I try and limit. So what I find is if I start to allow myself to have a ton of those, I mean, I have a chocolate cake with a chocolate ganache that I make that, if I start to make that frequently or eat that, I'll start to gain some weight.
Exactly. That's the problem, isn't it? With those kind of palatable foods, you just have to limit the frequency.
You just have to limit them. You don't have to not have them. I mean, that's the thing that I tell my patients. We actually do give patients a sample of the No Better Foods cookies in the office when we give them the ketogenic diet. We're like, here's a diet. If you like bacon, we're going to be friends. But if you want to be plant-based, we can do that too. And here's a cookie. And, the point being, it doesn't have to be restrictive so you can live a normal life. My husband and I go out to eat. It's a little bit harder being plant-based, but what I do is order a huge plate of vegetables, either salad or, vegetables there. I'm a little bit crazy when it comes to the oils because I've noticed that anything that's too high in omega-6 is a problem for me. So I do tend to bring either my own olive oil or avocado oil, or I do use MCT oil, specifically C8 oil. I get that mostly through Dave Asprey's site with the Brain Octane. I don't need to utilize that as much because I'm so keto adapted that, there isn't a big reason for me to need to increase my ketones and that. So therapeutically for patients for weight loss, I don't think we need to worry so much about what the ketone levels are. It's just about getting into that fat burning state. If I'm utilizing beta hydroxybutyrate to decrease inflammation in my patients, anecdotally, it seems to need to be around 1.5 millimolar or higher for them to get that benefit. So I will sometimes use MCT oil or very rarely exogenous ketones in my patients in order to help get them there during the transition. Mm-hmm. But once you're there, then, what's nice about the C8 oil is the body can't store it, either burns it or excretes it. So you can add C8 oil to your diet and it isn't going to increase it's not going to be stored, although it's still energy. So if you're providing enough energy through what you eat, the calorie model does still apply because the body's not going to tap into its stored fats if you are providing enough energy.
I know what happens with me with C8. I excrete it extremely quickly. It doesn't suit me and it's painful going through my gut.
Yeah. And so when I use that with patients, I think that's some of the benefits. So I tried exogenous ketones and I certainly don't recommend type 1 diabetics do it. I do a lot of sort of self-experimentation that drives my endocrinology friends crazy because they're worried that I'm going to kill myself. But I try not to do that. Originally the exogenous ketones tasted like jet fuel and they were not palatable. Now there are some other options for those. And again, I think there's limited reason to consider using them, but some neurologic reasons to use them. And there's more data coming out around that as we speak. As far as C8 oil, when I use that for my patients, because it's readily available, it goes easily into a smoothie. I tell them start with a very, very small amount until you see how it does. And that's the same for me with some of the resistant starches. So, there's data on insulin sensitivity and resistant starch and gut microbiome and what happens to the gut microbiome on the ketogenic diet. So I played with resistant starch. For me, resistant starch breaks me.
Right.
Like my gut just can't handle it and it doesn't matter how slowly I start. So, flax seeds are a great sort of low carb, high healthy fat, thing that can be utilized for a lot of different reasons and different recipes. Flax seeds and I do not get along. If I have flax seeds, my husband sleeps in a different room.
Right. Not to be recommended for you then.
No, I keep trying and I think, all right, I'll just do a little. And I can handle a little at this point, but I have to be super careful. So my gut microbiome doesn't like flax seeds. So I avoid flax seeds.
And I hear other people actually talking about flax seeds in impacting female hormone levels, and it doesn't agree with them from that perspective.
Yeah, the hormone level thing gets tricky. Soy comes up all the time, flax seeds. I avoided soy when I first initially started being plant-based keto because I had concerns about the phytoestrogens in them. I can tell you that I've added them back. I personally do just fine with soy. My hormone levels, I was getting into that perimenopausal state where I was estrogen dominant. I was needing to supplement progesterone. My hormone levels now are as if I was in my 20s again.
Wow.
So for me, it's not, maybe it was a help. Maybe it was not an impact, just getting my inflammation low and giving my body adequate sleep, all of our body hormones are made with cholesterol as its backbone. So we need to have adequate fat intake in order to have enough hormone production. So I can't tell you what fixed it.
Yeah, who knows what thing and what confounding elements you've got playing into the whole context of it, and let alone the fact that as your body changes, you might react differently to a food further on anyway.
Right. Which is why, I'm a little bit remiss sometimes to say, what do you eat now? Because 5 years from now, somebody may go back and listen to it and I may be eating something completely different. For me, I can't ever see myself going back to high carbohydrate because this is such a game changer as far as managing my diabetes. I'm super busy. And yes, you can eat a high carbohydrate diet and sugar surf, which is where you're looking at your continuous glucose monitor every 15 minutes or so and dosing insulin. And actually, I've been part of a group that has been utilizing an automated insulin delivery system, which is OpenAPS or Loop. And it's fantastic because I am just able on a low carbohydrate diet, I rarely need to bolus insulin. I just let those algorithms decide how much insulin I need. So, if I'm performing 12 hours of surgery in a day, the last thing I want to be focused on is what's going on with my blood sugar. And so by being super low carbohydrate, to be fair, do I think that my A1C needs to be 4.8? No. But if I start to add carbohydrate back, managing type 1 diabetes becomes a different animal. And I'm not interested in managing that. So by keeping my diet where it is, it makes diabetes there, but it doesn't take all of my attention. Whereas when I was high carbohydrate, it was constant interaction with where am I going? Am I going up? Am I going down? Do I need insulin? Do I need carbohydrate? 5 years from now, I may be eating very different. I may have added animal protein back. I don't know the answer to it. I'm going to base it on the feedback biochemically that my body's giving me with labs and how I feel. And that's the biggest number one thing that I ask my patients after I make a dietary intervention with them is, how do you feel? How's your sleep? And then we go from there.
Exactly. It's not only a question of what works for one person isn't necessarily going to work the same way for somebody else, but what works for you now is not necessarily going to be the same, a year, 5 years down the line.
Especially if these dietary interventions change our gut microbiome, which we know they do. And, the whole thing with the gut microbiome is still sort of a quagmire wrapped in a conundrum for me as far as we can measure some things, but I feel like we're looking at a shadow on the wall of the tip of the iceberg. So we can measure some changes, although the tools for measuring them still are not necessarily reproducible. And I don't know how to tell a patient, here's what we need to do in order to change your gut microbiome efficiently in a reproducible way. So for me, that science is incredibly interesting, but it's still in its infancy. But we know that it changes. Mm-hmm. And if it changes, and if our gut microbiome's health impacts our health, then what we need over time may change. And again, a lot of the studies that are done in men. And as women, we are premenstrual, menstrual, perimenopausal, and menopausal. And metabolically, they're very different states. So what applies to one group, I think as we start to do these studies, although there's limited funding for those, if you're running a study, you run it on men and women. We don't stratify out women into those categories, but it makes a difference.
I was going to ask you about the management of type 1 and carbohydrate level, because it's the kind of comment I see a lot on Facebook or in forums to do with type 1 diabetics, and they often get very angry about it and say that, we absolutely have to have a certain amount of carbohydrates to live and we need to treat that with insulin. But what is that minimum level? Because that seems to be the kind of levels I've seen discussed seem very high. The way you're talking, it sounds like you keep your carbohydrate level pretty low and thrive on that.
So there's some history here. So initially, type 1 diabetics were kept alive with a very low carbohydrate, ketogenic, Banting type diet. This goes back to Banting and Joslin, and there's a lot of history there.
So that's before we had insulin, yeah.
Before insulin existed, yeah. And then, ironically, different Banting, but an orthopaedic specialist was the one that discovered insulin. So when people say, Yeah, what is an orthopedic surgeon doing talking about diet and diabetes? I'm like, well, there's already precedent there.
And a good one.
Yeah, and I'm alive because of it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So insulin was discovered, and this is how we kept type 1 diabetics alive. My family members who have a history of type 1 diabetes were kept alive by insulin, thus me being here. And so the insulins and the way of delivering insulin initially, insulin is incredibly powerful. If you have too much of it, you will become hypoglycemic and die. So in order to avoid that, you had to have a certain amount of carbohydrate so that you could give insulin at the lowest level that was available. And so you didn't have a fatal hypoglycemic event.
Mm-hmm. So constant sort of balancing act.
Yep. So that's where a lot of that history came from. But if you look initially at the recommendations, it was, the dietary recommendations for type 1 diabetics has changed over time. And unfortunately, it shifted into this just eat what you want and cover it with insulin. And now we're seeing this huge spike in double diabetes where type 1 diabetics are becoming insulin resistant. So they're now type 1, type 2s. And it's changing. We just published a study about a month ago looking at management of type 1s using a low carbohydrate diet in conjunction with a group at Harvard and Duke with the type 1 grit group. So the problem is the recommendations of the societies are for a certain amount of carbohydrate, and the belief is that you need carbohydrate for the growing child's brain. And do we have the studies proving all of the ways that people can get into trouble with a low carbohydrate or all of the problems that can happen with it to make, physicians feel comfortable managing patients who are type 1 with a low carbohydrate diet? And the answer is no. Those studies need to be done in order for clinicians to feel comfortable, because the fear is that people will die of a hypoglycemic event. And endocrinologists, being well-meaning, don't want patients to die of a hypoglycemic event. The problem with the current recommendations are it leads to long-term complications of diabetes, but the assumption just is that exists because the disease exists. And so there are those of us that are out to prove that you can have totally normal A1C and normal blood sugars and be a thriving type 1 diabetic. And that's what the study showed, was that the type 1 grit group of children are thriving. So there is a lot of pushback because as a type 1 diabetic, we are all reliant on our endocrinology team to provide us with the medicines that keep us alive. And if your team doesn't believe that a low carbohydrate diet is safe, then you're told by people who you respect and who you rely upon that you require carbohydrate. And then there's a whole, kids being kids and allowing the kids to have the cake at the party. Although, my kids aren't diabetic, but we have tons of low carbohydrate treats that we make. And they're not super low carb, but they're low carb and, they do just fine. And the type 1 grit kids do just fine. So, parents taking care of children who are diabetic, it's a really, really hard life. And there's a lot of fear around how do I keep my kid alive and healthy and safe? And no parent wants to be responsible for their child dying of a hypoglycemic event. Although if we look at Dr. Bernstein and we look at the type 1 grit group, the higher your carbohydrate intake, the more insulin you need to give, the larger the chance you're going to have a clinically significant hypoglycemic event.
That just seems that's the logic for me. I have a very logical brain, and I like to understand the logic of something.
Yeah, don't confuse logic with belief, though.
Yeah, but I can understand that there is a minimum, but I can't see why it can't be low. My logic says, well, I don't see the logic of constantly putting a high carbohydrate amount in, because then you need the high insulin to deal with that. So you're constantly having to juggle. It just seems if you take those both down, to a much more manageable level. So those peaks, those highs and lows become a much gentler up and down. That just seems logically a much more sensible plan.
Yep. And, my undergraduate was in biology and chemistry, and, I went to medical school and trained as a pathologist, and, now I'm a surgeon, and I can say that it's almost impossible for me to exactly figure out the way the body would, how to dose insulin for an apple, because it depends on how big is the apple, how ripe is the apple, what variety is the apple, what did I eat earlier that day? Where was my blood sugar when I started it? How did I sleep the night before? At what point in my menstrual cycle am I? Like, there's so many factors that impact how much insulin that you give. And so for me, it's just easier to exclude that and decrease the variable. And that's what makes my life easier, so that I can get a quality night's sleep and not be chasing blood sugars all day.
Because also from the fear of a hypo, isn't it true as well that, the higher the spike, the more likely, the lower the trough on the other side, the lower the more significant the crash is likely to be.
Yep. So you run into problems with diabetic ketoacidosis when you're high, and fatal hypoglycemic events when you're too low. Now, there is the possibility, despite the fact that you can be in DKA and have a normal blood sugar, which gets somewhat controversial, but it can happen. It actually happened to me because I had sort of depleted all of my glycogen stores, and whether it's called starvation ketoacidosis or diabetic ketoacidosis was sort of splitting hairs, but that can happen. So, type 1 diabetes is a challenge to manage, but I live a super active life. I'm very busy. I do surgery. I've never had any issue with my blood sugar in the operating room. 2 weeks ago, climbed a mountain with my husband, and my blood sugar wasn't an issue the entire time. I lift weights. I cycle. I have 2 kids. I have a husband who's a surgeon. Our lives are crazy busy, and I want diabetes to impact it as little as possible. And for me, that means low carbohydrate.
Yes, it seems to me that management really is the key bit we need to focus on. When I mentioned earlier about this program on television where they seem to be fixing the problem really quickly, and they were getting very excited about it, understandably, and saying, this is going to save the NHS millions, and
right.
This is going to be such a profound change. But actually, the change is going to exist in the management. There's no point in you could put every type 2 diabetic in the country on this program that they saw amazing results in 2 months. But what's going to happen after that?
Right.
And it's got to be something that you can sustain. And I think that's where it comes back time and time again, that this low carb, higher fat way of eating is just easier to sustain than calorie deficits and low fat. Anyone can summon up the motivation, can't they, to do 2 weeks, 2 months, 6 months even of kind of a quite extreme way of eating for a particular goal, be that weight loss or reversing their type 2 diabetes, whatever it is. Anyone can sustain it for a particular fairly short burst, but what comes after that?
Yeah, and that's the criticism, ironically, of the low carbohydrate diet, is that it's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable. Well, it's the most sustainable plan I've ever come across.
Same for me. I mean, again, I don't feel deprived. It's not an issue. And the other benefit of being in ketosis all the time from the standpoint of being a type 1 diabetic is my brain functions on ketones. So if my blood sugar gets low, my brain, there was a study, sort of an infamous study by Cahill, and there's a study out of Yale showing that if ketones are present, the cognitive impact of a hypoglycemic event down to very low levels is mitigated.
Right.
So I actually had it happen where I had just switched to an insulin pump. I had bulletproof coffee before I got onto a plane. My blood sugar was in, the high 70s, low 80s when I got onto the plane. I was actually emailing David Ludwig at Harvard at the time from the air. And all of a sudden, my continuous glucose monitor started alarming that I was crashing. I couldn't figure out what was going on. Well, as it turned out, air bubbles and fluid expansion that happens with the pressure changes in a plane had delivered some insulin to me. And so I don't usually keep a lot of glucose around. So I was eating every glucose tab that I could find that I had brought with me. But my brain, I was still emailing him at the time saying, wow, this is going on right now. Whereas if I wasn't keto adapted, granted, I had some C8 oil that morning and was in nutritional ketosis. If that hadn't happened, I may not be here to tell you about it today. Or it would have been, I was alone on the plane. My glucose tabs were actually in the overhead bin, which was stupid. I don't do that anymore. It was just an inadvertent error. But those are the things that result in type 1s dying.
Mm.
So for me, being in ketosis potentially,
saved your life.
Had a significant impact on my health at that moment.
What a difference. And I mean, it sounds like it, and it time and time again, people, talk about this and, it's going to be difficult to sustain and difficult to eat that way. But no, there are benefits. It's not a case of having to tolerate this way of eating. We can enjoy it, but not only that, but when you thrive on it as well. So it's not like people who, are say calorie restricting and they're miserable with the eating part of their life. They're always miserable with, but they say, but yeah, I've lost the weight and I'm keeping it off. And in general, I feel okay, maybe a bit miserable sometimes, but and so it's worth it.
Right. And when I was calorie restricted, I had to track constantly because it's incredibly easy to overeat calories. So, I was weighing and measuring all of my food. I can say now I just eat. I will track from time to time if I want to tweak something or I want to look at my micronutrient intake, but I no longer need to track what I eat in order not to gain weight. And it's effortless. I don't crave foods. I don't emotionally eat. And I don't eat at night anymore. Like all of those things just went away. And I have an Instagram page that I post a lot of the different foods that I eat. And I post a lot of things that are unusual. I mean, people know how to roast broccoli, so I don't post simple things like that. But there's a lot of question around how do I eat? What do I eat? And the foods are amazing and delicious, and my family eats them and loves them. And it's not hard, and I get excited about finding new recipes and, doing new things. There is a cookbook that Julie Piot and Rich Roll just put out called the Plant-Based Way Italia. And, initially you would think, oh, I can't buy an Italian cookbook, but she's got a ton of nut cheeses that are in there and low carbohydrate, chia pudding, and a lot of the things that we in the low carb community would eat. And even the risotto recipes and the pasta recipes, you can just sub out, miracle noodles or zucchini noodles, or for the risotto, cauliflower rice, which, sometimes I feel like I worship at the altar of cauliflower because I can make cauliflower into just about anything. Around the Easter holiday, I posted one of those Reese's peanut butter cup eggs.
Hilarious, and say, that meme, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can I make it from cauliflower?
Like a prize to the person who can make this Reese's peanut butter egg out of cauliflower. And to be fair, people were like, oh, you can totally replicate that recipe without cauliflower. I'm like, I know. I can totally replicate that recipe and make it taste great. But I want to see, can you use cauliflower? Like I have a pudding that I make for my kids that has steamed cauliflower in it, and they're none the wiser that it's in there.
Interesting.
So,
and do you find that we hear about this magic keeping below 20 grams of carbs, but do you find, again, I'm just wondering if it's partly to do with your body adapting, that you can stay in ketosis with a higher level of carbs? Because it seems to me, even if you're eating, a lot of the fats and things, you're simply probably going to have to eat more net carbs just to get enough food in.
Right. So it depends on what your goals are as far as your level of ketones.
Oh, of course.
And I check mine on a regular basis. Couple times a day sometimes if I'm tweaking something. And every month I do 5 days of sort of a modified fast. And so maybe that helps to keep me in ketosis and allow me to have more of the non-starchy vegetables. This is where I think counting net carbs. So if I look at my total daily carbohydrate, it probably is in the 50 to 70 range, but only about 20 of those to 25 are net carbs. Right. And perhaps I can eat more. I'm not just starting out at this. This is a long-term journey that I've been on. So maybe I can stay in ketosis with higher amounts of non-starchy vegetables. But I have patients that are just starting out and they do, if we're talking about leafy greens, I feel like you can eat an almost unlimited amount of them. And they make a great carrier for healthy fats.
Exactly. I only really mention keto level because it's a way to measure. I don't believe that it's something that's necessary. You don't have to be in a certain range to be successful unless you do
with weight loss.
Exactly. Right. There are conditions where it's necessary, and that's a different ballgame.
If I'm using it for inflammation with my patients, there's again measuring acetoacetate in the urine has its drawbacks, but I will utilize that with patients because it's cheap, it's readily available, and it gives them an idea, are they getting into ketosis?
Exactly.
And so then if I have somebody that we're really trying to dial it in, then I'll have them get a ketone blood meter so that we can measure beta hydroxybutyrate or one of the ketonics acetone meters if we're trying to utilize a therapeutic ketone level. But those are two different patient populations.
Exactly. Well, this has been fascinating, and I can't wait to get on Instagram and have a look at some of your pictures and explore. When you were talking about microgreens, I'm a fan of microgreens. They became very trendy and popular, didn't they? But they actually taste delicious. That's because the flavour is so intensified, isn't it, into that tiny little sprout?
Yeah, and the nutrients are, significant in them. And that becomes a whole separate discussion. There are some people who are sensitive to certain lectins in plants, and that's a real thing. I think it's not as widespread as those, who are promoting a low lectin diet would have us believe, but it's a factor. But yes, those phytonutrients are super high in those very young plants, and the taste is amazing.
Oh, it is amazing. I sprout rocket. I love rocket anyway, but the sprouted seeds, just the intense flavor in that tiny little sprout is it's incredible. It's lovely. I do really love it.
You clearly sound deprived.
Yeah. Well, the annoying thing for me is having to wait for them to grow. So
right.
I sow them and they're on my windowsill, and it's it's every day you look at them and when are they going to be ready?
Yep, absolutely. That's my sprouts. I just keep a continuing supply of them in the pantry.
That's the thing. You just need a constant turnover, don't you?
Yep.
Well, it's been fabulous. I could go on talking for hours, but perhaps you'd like to round off with a top tip for our listeners.
I think the top tip is to check in with yourself and listen to what your body's telling you. If that's the one piece of advice that I could give everyone having this journey, would be, if you're not feeling great, explore why. And it may mean doing something that goes counter to what your belief system has become over what made you successful. But that was where I struggled the most, was where I kept repeating things that weren't working because I believed that was the best way to do it. So that's the question that I'm always asking myself, either on labs or just on how I feel, how I sleep, what are my energy levels, what's my skin look like, is what is my body telling me, and then giving that the regard that is necessary, because it's very real. Our bodies, again, are not stupid. If we're thriving, we will know it. Your energy levels should feel good. And when they don't, that's an important factor.
Yes, I do think that's one of the things about this way of eating, that it does become quite empowering, because you do start recognizing all those signals. And, I see a lot of people just getting the confidence to say, well, no, I'm not going to do what you say because I know now what works for me. I know very clearly what works for me because I'm not just using a diet plan you gave me and the numbers on the scale. I'm going by how I feel. I feel amazing. So this is working. And when I did what you were telling me to do, I felt like crap. And so that can't be amazing, even if I lost the weight you said I was going to, or whatever it is. And, so I think it's so important, isn't it, to have that confidence and belief in yourself.
Absolutely. And again, just listen to your body. It will give you signals, and it's the smartest person in the room when it comes to your health.
Yeah, you're your own expert.
Absolutely. And play with it. Don't be afraid to play with it and figure out what works for you.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today, Keri. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we talked about are things that aren't really being talked about in this community. So I'm really glad to be able to have the opportunity to share my experiences so that it broadens the number of people. There's a vegan keto, it's called Vegan Keto Made Simple Facebook group. And the last I looked, which was a couple of weeks, and it started about a year ago, there's over 30,000 members in it now.
Wow.
And people post recipes, and, there's some nuanced with getting enough nutrients on the vegan keto way. But for people who are interested in being plant-based, and there's varying reasons why to do that, a ketogenic diet, you and I have both seen that can be super helpful. And I think it broadens the conversation when we talk about these different ways of approaching a low-carb ketogenic type diet.
Exactly. And there are many ways to achieve the right results for you. And there is no one way, and it's fantastic to hear from someone who's in this so-called really tiny minority group that it's really difficult to sustain a ketogenic diet if you're vegan. And people almost get scared about asking. I've seen these.
If you think that, though, it's not.
No, exactly. That's what it's been so fantastic to see illustrated. You see these tentative people putting out these tentative little questions. I'm almost afraid to ask this, but can I do vegetarian keto? Can I even, heaven forfend, do vegan keto? And, up until now, my response has been, well, yeah, vegetarian, easy, no problem. Right. But vegan is going to be a bit more difficult. So it's been really educational for me to hear the kind of variety, and how interesting you can make a low carb ketogenic diet being vegan. So it's wonderful to have a resource somewhere to point people to now. Thank you for that.
No, thank you so much. And I keep getting asked to write the book, and if there are more hours in the day.
I was going to say that's what we need next.
I know. If I could just get 1 extra hour a day, it would be done. But I have this quirky thing of having a surgical career as my day job, and
darn it.
It will get done.
Yeah.
It will get done.
Fabulous. Thank you very much.
So thank you for the opportunity.
To get the resources and links from the show, please go to ketowomanpodcast.com. Are you my next extraordinary woman? Maybe you've got an idea for a show, a topic you want to hear about. Let me know how I can tickle your earbuds by dropping me a line at daisy@ketowomanpodcast.com. If you fancy joining me on this exciting adventure and want to help me create new episodes, please go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/ketowoman, or simply hit the support button on the Keto Woman Podcast website. It's thanks to the two keto dudes that I'm hosting this podcast. So please consider heading to their Patreon page at patreon.2keto.com and help them bring you more podcasts like this one. Please help other people hear about and find this podcast by reviewing the show on iTunes and Facebook. Every star and review really does help. It doesn't go unnoticed by me, the people who regularly like, share and comment on my posts. Your support means the world to me. Thank you. This week's quote is from Flora Whitmore. The doors we open and close each day decide the lives we live. Bye-bye, Keto Lovelies.